So I think that what we're seeing across the board is massive changes, and also at the same time unpredictability in a level that is not something that in recent years we've been familiar with. And so even typical ways of how forms are adjudicated or how petitions are decided is not necessarily consistent with how they're being decided now. And add on to that, of course, new fees, and it's more expensive, everything takes longer.
Welcome to another episode of Immigration and Mobility Decoded by Envoy Global. I am one of your hosts, Cecily Petrie, joined by my co host, Eric Prado. Today, we have a great episode with Cecilia Esterline, who is the Senior Immigration Policy Analyst at Niskanen Center. We had a great episode and conversation with Cecilia, diving into some data and some recent articles that she's written. Eric, would love to hear your thoughts on the episode as a kind of prelude to our conversation.
Yeah, we had a great time chatting with Cecilia. She's recently put out a ton of great pieces where she's analyzed some recent government immigration data from Department of Labor, State Department, USCIS, etc. So we talk a little bit about that, and I think her analysis kind of reflects the current state of legal immigration, which is our obviously our area of focus. And I think it was a really interesting conversation, where we definitely dive into the numbers, and then we also chat about a few other interesting topics, some policy proposals that have come out, which she has her eye on, um and I think just how HR employers can best prepare and just navigate. I think Cecily, you put it kind of in a good way in terms of just the language, just the whiplash of all the changes that have happened, and I think kind of may happen in the future. Anything that you would add?
I think it was just a thoughtful conversation about kind of taking a look at the bigger picture of legal immigration and
Yeah.
dissecting some of the changes that we've seen. And also, it can be the uncertainties that we're seeing and how you can take that approach and look at the numbers and compare it to what we've seen in the past and, move forward from there. And also,
Hmm.
maybe taking a look at some of the more promising reforms. If we're taking a look at some of the optimism within the space, we'll also try to have that at times too. But
Yeah.
overall, it's oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, I think some of the optimistic reforms, right? I think the current administration is definitely making a big push for modernizing the immigration system, particularly more digitization. So I think it is kind of like that is part of that, as you said, like the optimistic, just kind of like bringing it up to 2025 standards, if you will.
Exactly. Yes, a more tech-driven approach. I think we're all kind of looking for that in our everyday life and in implementing that. So it needs to be a part of immigration as well, which is great. But we have this episode with Cecilia, but first, we would love for you all to subscribe to our YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe so that you can be up to date on all new episodes from Immigration and Mobility Decoded. And we would love to hear from you about any comments that you have relating to the episodes. In the show notes today, we will have the few articles that we reference from Cecilia linked, as well as our 2025 Immigration Trends Report for you to download. Now, here's our episode with Cecilia Esterline.
And welcome to another episode of Immigration and Mobility Decoded, presented by Envoy Global. Today's guest, I'm very excited to introduce Cecilia Esterline, and welcome to another episode of Immigration and Mobility Decoded, presented by Envoy Global. Today's guest, I am very excited to introduce Cecilia Esterline, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center. Cecilia, how's it going? Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
Cecilia, you joined the esteemed Third Timers Club. This is your third time on the show. I think if I recall, you were one of the very first guests we had when we launched the show back in 2023. And then in January of 24, we actually did an in-person podcast, which was awesome. So yeah, welcome to the Third Timers Club.
Thank you. It's been great to see you guys evolve and everything that you've covered. You've been there through a lot of big changes, so it's been great to be
Yeah,
involved.
definitely. Yeah, we're very excited to talk with you. You've recently put out a lot of great research and some commentary that we're very much looking forward to discussing with you today. But before we hop into before we hop into the meat of conversation, Cecily and I just want to quickly ask you some questions. Really about your background. I know in the past we've asked you, but maybe for some new listeners, just want to learn more about your background and how you came to be the Senior Immigration Policy Analyst at the Niskanen Center.
Yeah, so I actually used to work in direct services for immigration. I was both a paralegal at a business immigration law firm, so kind of doing the high skilled corporate immigration that you might think of that I primarily now cover in my portfolio at Niskanen. But I've also been in direct services previously of just walk in legal advice or interpretation or helping with refugee resettlement. So I kind of came to the immigration policy world through a different route than a lot of people because I was acting in it kind of in a direct way before. So it's been great to have that experience as well.
Nice, awesome. Um, so we're gonna dive into some data, Cecilia, but I guess kind of the 1,000 foot picture, if you will. Can you walk us through the current landscape of employment-based, visa policy in the U.S.? Obviously, a lot has changed since you and I last spoke in January of 2024. But how would you describe the current environment?
Yeah, I would say that a lot has changed is kind of an understatement. And I'm sure you know that. I don't think I have to tell any of your listeners who are likely at least someone involved in this space that a lot has changed. And that has been some things have been announced publicly and shared openly what those changes are. And others have kind of been things that we have all found out about anecdotally first, and then maybe it later shows up in some data, and then maybe eventually it comes out in a kind of press release or some sort of leaked memo. And so I think that what has changed is the way that forms are being adjudicated, the way that USCIS is handling things, the USCIS capacity. We know that at least 450 USCIS officers have been moved from adjudicating to working at ICE. And so we have this kind of capacity constraints at USCIS. Simultaneously, we have things that are happening at the consulates. So even if someone gets through USCIS, when they have new interview requirements or new pressures that USCIS are at state for different interview requirements and different fingerprinting and social media reviews. And while all of this might not apply directly to the employment based sphere, when you have the same group of people working or staffing those interviews, now you have limited resources and capacity to handle that. And so I think that what we're seeing across the board is massive changes and also at the same time unpredictability and a level that is not something that in recent years we've been familiar with. And so even typical ways of how forms are adjudicated or how petitions are decided is not necessarily consistent with how they're being decided now. And add on to that, of course, new fees, and it's more expensive. Everything takes longer. And so I think it's a very challenging environment right now for employers that really rely on foreign talent to ensure that they can continue their productivity and meeting their goals as a business and organization.
You highlighting some of those changes and unpredictability that we're seeing in the space, kind of taking it from the flip side. What are some of the most promising reforms or proposals that you've seen recently in the space?
I think there's been a lot. I think you have people who are really focused on what is going to be the long-term plan in immigration, what's going to be happening several years from now. And then you have some people who are just trying to kind of figure out how to play defense in this very challenging environment, so to speak, on how to continue ensuring that we get in the people that we need. But I also think it's important to recognize that there are things that I think could indicate some level of hope or bright light, I guess, from even actions that the administration is taking. For instance, we can look at things like the changes that they're making to electronic payments. Of course, there are individuals who may have difficult circumstances related to that. But I think that even if that policy in particular is not perfect in the way that it is being implemented or designed for some individual clients, I think at the same time, what we can see is that modernization, digitization is still a priority of something that they're moving towards. And so I think that as we think of the future of what we want in a USCIS, being able to file more things online, being able to process things online, and get faster information, better adjudications, better efficiency in that way. I think to me, like some of those things are somewhat encouraging. And so I hope that things will continue to move in that direction and that all of the people who are doing the good work to think about what's coming next in the near and long-term future will continue doing that work so that we can, respond to the immediate challenges, but also recognize where there are potential opportunities for good coming out of this administration as well.
Definitely, yeah. I think the digitization is definitely a big one, and if I recall, the first Trump administration made the push for electronic registration, which is a big part of the current H-1B lottery. And there's some proposals in the works still. And I think another thing, particularly in the first administration, and as we're going to discuss now, is the release of data. Just some really good data coming out of the government. And so Cecilia recently wrote about some of that data that came out as of late August of 2025. What what did your initial analysis discover?
Sure. I think that what I tried to do was provide kind of a centralized resource of what are the current status of things in legal immigration, because for those of everyone who's affected by any of this, it's not necessarily easy to get immediate analysis or to kind of understand it. And so that was hopefully what I was trying to do with this data. And I have cautioned against kind of using any one form's pattern from this very limited data set, because from the comprehensive data that we have for all USCIS forms, it's only available for January through March. We have a smaller subset available through some of the summer, but of course, like that's not even, half of the forms that USCIS uses. And so I think that for me, what I was most concerned by are the overall trends compared to both a year ago and compared to the first quarter, which would be kind of from October to December. That January through March period, even though we were receiving more forms than the same time last year, the completion levels were down. And so I do think there's some level that is understandable when you have a new administration, there are new priorities and new, understanding of how they want things done. I think if any of us get a new manager, it's obviously a change in how we operate. And so I think that some slowdown is understandable to a certain extent. But I think coupled with the information that we have about USCIS officers that have been reassigned or voluntarily relocated to ICE, then we have this situation where adjudications are down. And then we have on top of that new responsibilities that are being added on to USCIS. And we all heard the announcement about the neighborhood checks, of course, and now we have USCIS law enforcement, but USCIS neighborhood checks might not have anything to do with employment immigration for the most part, but those are also USCIS officers that will have to be doing that job of going to door to ask people about that. And so I think that some of the staffing pressures have played out in the overall numbers of trends of they're just slower in terms of the number of cases that they are able to close and move through in a timely manner. And considering the immense backlog that is already at USCIS, this is quite concerning. And I am anxiously waiting to see what the Q4 data and the Q3 data reveal about what has actually been happening since then overall. But I do think it is a concerning initial evaluation.
How much of an impact did the flurry of activity in the since January Department of Government Efficiency Did they have much of an impact in terms of, reducing headcount and implementing processes or procedures that led to processing slowdowns?
So I have to think that in some senses, immigration was almost the exception to Doge. Of course, there have been reports of reduction of forced emails and things like that, but immigration as a whole, if you include the enforcement aspect, has grown in personnel. They've had more spending, and so I think that in some senses they have been spared. I don't think they've been affected as heavily as other agencies have. And even the Department of State that lost over 1,000 staff, those were primarily those who are here in the US and not necessarily affecting those who are at consulates abroad doing consular services, conducting interviews, and that kind of thing. And so I think that in a large sense, they have been the exception from that, but they've still had some of their officers be turned from adjudicating to kind of this vetting, security, and enforcement angle, which I think has affected as well their adjudication timelines.
You mentioned counselors abroad. As part of this data release, you did also look at counselor wait times as of August 18th, 2025. Cecilia, what did your analysis uncover when looking at counselor wait times and et cetera?
The problem is that some, consulates have had increases in wait times that are absurd increases since January, and others have had, some reasonable improvements made. And so I think that, overall, though, the numbers are trending up and interview wait times are trending upward. And this was all before the changes that were coming on September 2nd. So we know that on September 2nd, they began to conduct interviews without the kind of support of the same level of waivers that we've had for the past several years. And so, and as much egregiously as I've raised in my writing previously, is that they will now be interviewing children, including newborns and babies as well. And those are interview slots that could be going to someone else. And so I think that the fact that there were already upward trends in many consulates around the world is concerning. We also had the summer shutdown of student visa interviews and the addition of social media review that they have openly said, with social media review, there may be a need to have fewer appointments available because they understand that this is a drain on staff time. And so I think that even though we saw in August that the social media review was already in effect, and so student interviews wait times increased the sharpest between January and June and August. They increased over 250%. Obviously, there's more demand in August as well. So there's, you can take that with a grain of salt. But I think that, we also have starting in September, and we should be watching those times as well. What is happening after these new interview requirements have been implemented, and how will that affect staffing at consulate capacity and as well as their ability to provide timely interviews, particularly as we think about all of the events that are to come and incoming seasons for H2s and anything like that that we have to focus on.
Yeah, and as we're recording this a few days after the weekend news, where the State Department, effective immediately, are requiring non-immigrant visa applicants, they must schedule interviews in their country of nationality or residence. So I would imagine that's also going to increase wait times.
I think at some places that have high numbers of third country nationals, it's possible that it kind of levels off, particularly in Europe or places where they have seen high levels of third country nationals. Perhaps that puts a kind of control on their wait times. However, it may increase wait times at places that are already experiencing very high wait times because even then those individuals in those countries have nowhere else to that they were able to go. So I think it could have a improvement effect at certain consulates, but at many it will make things that are already bad worse.
Yeah. I mean, I just have to ask. I mean, how would you imagine an interview goes with a newborn or a baby? How might that work?
I think it's kind of, ridiculous in a sense that if the parent also needs to attend an interview, requiring the child to come along, if they're also getting a visa, maybe makes sense. But the idea that if a parent has a valid tourist visa and they would like to come to the US, but they had a child a few weeks ago and they want to bring their child, the idea that the parent would not have to go, but the child would. It seems absurd to me because, of course, it's still the parent answering, and you have already decided that the parent has a visa. They don't need to come back again. So to me, it's kind of ridiculous, but I can't even imagine the amount of time that we will be spending on that. Hopefully not much, but
Right, as well as the level of stress. I mean, just get carrying a newborn around, probably sitting around for at least, a few hours, for the parent. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. Um, Looking at some the some additional data that you looked at, you also looked at some data from the Department of Labor, specifically PERM processing times, and that data is current as of August 14th, 2025. What stood out to you when looking at PERM processing times? I think, if I recall, you found that they too have been rising since January, though you wrote that they have leveled off. You also wrote that the recently the administration created the Office of Immigration Policy within the Department of Labor. So just curious to hear your takeaways about perm processing times, and then the role that you think this new office might take, or might have, to reduce perm delays.
perm delays and perm processing times in general at the Department of Labor have been increasing sharply and quickly for quite some time now, including in the past administration. And what I actually found encouraging is though we hit a new high at one point during this administration of 500 days as a wait time for just an initial review of a perm application, what I also saw was that there was a slowdown in that rate of growth that we were experiencing under the previous administration. There was a slowdown and then a kind of leveling off. And so, though we haven't seen significant reductions in that yet, I do hope that the Office of Immigration Policy will at least take this up as part of their portfolio. I know they're publicly really focusing on streamlining H2s, as that's a priority of this administration, but I at least will be advocating for them as well to focus on perm delays as an essential tool of, getting people out of this wait time so that they can, do the things that they're meant to be doing here in this country. And so I think that it's an important symbol. I think that at least the Office of Immigration Policy, if nothing else, they have been, open to being communicative with stakeholders and with others in the area of immigration. So I think that it at least gives the opportunity for those who are affected to raise their concerns, and especially employers to raise those concerns with the Department of Labor and communicate the difficulties that these perm delays create. And so hopefully it will be part of their portfolio and their priorities for the coming year as well.
Nice. You mentioned students earlier, international students, which you also looked at some data about. Looking at international student enrollment data, I think in the media, et cetera, there's the prevailing theory that enrollment will decline, likely starting with this current fall semester. Has your analysis corroborated this theory?
I still buy into this theory to some extent, just because there are significant delays and reports that are coming out of universities that kind of tend to show that. But what hasn't shown up yet is the level of CVIS records or active student enrollment records that is declined. We're actually up compared to this time last year. And so these active CVIS records, though, also obviously include those who are on optional practical training still and other things. And so I think that there could be a time where in September or October or even into November, if some people are transitioning to H1Bs, that we might see that these kind of drop offs come later. That are being reported by universities that are saying their enrollment has dropped significantly. And so I will be curious to see how that plays out with the CVIS record numbers. But thus far, the CVIS records continue to be higher than they were last year. And so I think it points to resilience, and that is in the interest of these students in coming to the US or in those that are already here in maintaining their status here in the United States as they continue their studies, as they are in optional practical training or anything else. I think that's a testament to that. But I think there is likely to be a drop off soon, as all the universities are saying as much. But I haven't seen it play out yet in the CVIS data.
Would you buy into the theory or idea that maybe there's a delayed drop off because the current fall incoming classes, right, probably were accepted last spring. So maybe the drop off, to your point, is delayed maybe till next fall or et cetera.
Sure, how it works with the universities. When do they report their CVIS records? How quickly is this data reflected on a national scale? And so it's hard to say if someone was accepted, but then they didn't get their visa in time. Do they still have an active CVIS record because they had to use that to get their visa? I'm not sure what the timeline is exactly on that. So I would be interested to kind of watch and see what happens over the next few months with the data to see how quickly does it actually reflect what all these universities are saying is happening on their end. How quickly does that show up in the CBIS national data as well?
Got it. Cecilia, final question from me on this particular section regarding your legal immigration numbers, looking at data from as of through August 2025. Um, just when you're diving into the government data, I'm just curious how your mind works and just kind of what sticks out to you when doing these deep dives.
I think that for me, what is important is putting the numbers in context because the numbers that are coming out, they often only show one quarter at a time or 1 month at a time. And it's really hard to say, like, is that a good number? Is that a bad number? Like, it can still be a very high processing time, but maybe it's been an improvement compared to last month or compared to this time last year. And so I really do try to put it in context of the historical context of what was happening previously and kind of combining that data as it is available as much as possible. And then I also tried to think about things that might be affecting it otherwise that are not necessarily obvious. When we talk about international students, maybe compared to last month or the month before, they're higher. But of course, summer numbers might drop anyway. So maybe I should instead compare it to this time last year. And so that's what I tried to do as much as possible, to think about are the circumstances surrounding this particular visa type or this particular data set that might be relevant. And then also, even for the things that I'm not personally familiar with quite as much, I at least try to provide context of compared to last year, compared to this time before this change in administration, and going through those kinds of things and seeing what sticks out as significant changes. Some things kind of remain steady, and that's not as noteworthy. But when things are changing or moving differently from they have in the past, then I think it's something that makes me pay attention.
So, continuing on from that, back in April, you authorized a piece outlining how President Trump's second term has dramatically disrupted the legal immigration system in the US, which we're now seeing in the numbers as we recently discussed. Looking to his first day back in office, Trump signed executive orders targeting illegal immigration, but these also had sweeping effects on legal immigration. So, routine operations at USCIS, consulates, and ports of entry were disrupted, complicating travel and eliminating some of the legal pathways. So the Trump administration's legal immigration policies have created widespread confusion, something we talked about the top of the call, and delays and economic consequences. While aiming at curbing illegal immigration, these challenges have deeply affected legal immigrants, international visitors, and the agencies that serve them. So if we're zooming out on this and viewing that big picture, what are the ongoing impacts of this kind of whiplash within our legal immigration system?
I think whiplash is a perfectly appropriate word for what we're seeing is this kind of sense of uncertainty and changes that are happening very quickly from one day to the next, like were just talked about with the changes to third country national processing. For first, it was just immigrant visas, and now it's also non-immigrant visas, and everything's kind of changing very quickly. And so I think that it leaves a very concerning, place for employers to be, particularly if we think about employers who might be affected by this heightened level of enforcement, whether or not they were hiring workers who were not properly authorized to work in the United States. There are also individuals who are afraid to show up to work as a result of the heightened enforcement. And they, as the employers, if they don't have the ability to turn to an American workforce, if that workforce is not available, they will be turning to these kind of other employment programs to fill in those gaps. And if that is the case, there will be heightened pressure on programs that are already under strain. And then there's slower processing times. If you need an H-2B for a seasonal job and there are, TPS workers perhaps are currently losing their work authorization, you might try to get an H-2B that has a limited time window of being able to get it. And then you have these additional delays, new interview requirements, and all of these other things that kind of complicate the process for you. And so I think that we've seen it in the past, and I know you guys highlight this kind of work in your immigration trends report, of where employers that are very resilient, they kind of pivot. And do they send people to work remotely from Canada? Do they send people to work remotely from elsewhere? Or do they downscale in some size of reducing hours? We see this sometimes with people who have summer productions or summer amusement parks or restaurants. Maybe they reduce their hours as a result of an inability to get their labor on time. But for something like the agricultural industry, they can't necessarily do that the same way or as rapidly. And then we see things like crops, rotting in the fields and not getting picked in time. And it can cost just a 3-day delay, it can cost farmers thousands of dollars just by these minor delays or seemingly minor delays that are really crucial to their workforce. And so I think that this kind of whiplash, as you called it, is this reflective of this back and forth that has been happening of changing rules that leads to unpredictability and instability for businesses who are really trying to operate within the rules here, who are trying to operate within the rules and trying to bring the people that they need here legally and timely. But then you end up in this situation where they kind of run into barriers at every step of the way, from delays at USCIS to new consular requirements to where they have to go to get their visa and everything. So it's kind of been this really chaotic time for the legal immigration sphere. And I think that now, even though there continues to be a focus on illegal immigration and that enforcement side of redirecting staff from across the federal government to support those efforts, we also see new rules that are slowly coming out to really affirmatively address that legal immigration question. And it's kind of still in contrast to what is being said. We have just covered throughout this episode a few different instances of policies directed particularly at international students. And at the same time, President Trump has said that he would like to welcome 600,000 in Chinese students, which is more than double what we have now. And so there's kind of this uncertainty of what do you believe or what do you follow if you're trying to follow the rules, because at one point one policy may say things, the rhetoric may indicate another. And so it's a really very confusing time for anyone who's trying to operate legally within this framework.
And I mean, you mentioned it with Envoy Global's trends report. I think one of the main or top of the concerns that we were seeing from the individuals that we surveyed was this policy change, and that being a huge concern for them running immigration programs. So it's an important call out from your side and seeing this big picture in immigration and kind of dissecting that data of what we're looking at from individuals running programs and how they're looking at shifting policies to keep up with the uncertainty. I think that was a clear point that you brought up in terms of everyone zooming out and getting that broader picture of what we can maybe think to expect, but that there is still that uncertainty associated with everything going on in the space. Kind of leading me to, the aforementioned ongoing impacts on legal immigration systems and that focus of what we're seeing or have seen in the space at present. As we look ahead to 2026, and again, kind of taking that big picture approach, where do you think the administration turns their focus to regarding legal immigration?
So I think that we'll see a lot coming in the next few months, before or after the end of the year. I don't know. All of it is coming kind of on uncertain timelines. We know that the weighted H-1B rule is coming down the pipeline. I think that one has been talked about a lot, but there is another rule that is also in the regulatory agenda that we know is in the works, and that will revise the cap exemption eligibility. And it also emphasized a focus on third-party work sites. And so I think that that's something we have maybe coming down the line. I have also long said that the first administration tried to change not just the selection in the lottery, but also how the prevailing wage levels are calculated. and the percentiles that they need to reach. And I think that though they face legal challenges in the first administration in doing that, I think that there will be at least an attempt to do that again. And so I think that that's likely coming down the line. There's also a rule in the works in the regulatory agenda on optional practical training. The description on that one is a little bit more vague and just says that it's going to revise the program in order to be in line with the program's intentions. And I think that that leaves a lot to interpretation. I think there could be cuts to the number of programs or degrees that are designated for STEM OPT, which would really impact employers who normally might be able to have these individuals working without having to secure an H-1B for 3 years, and now they would potentially lose that 2-year extension. And so I think that that might be relevant to your audience. I think there will also be, I have said as well previously, that I do think at some point there will be an effort to address anyone who has received work authorization through regulation. Obviously, that includes the status of optional practical training, but it also includes H4s. L2s, I think, are a little bit different just because they have that court case involved with their work authorization incident to status. But I do think that H4s are something that could be targeted, and their work authorization could be a priority of this administration to eliminate. And so I think that all of those things are coming at once. And I think we will see heightened scrutiny, heightened security, and potential additional screenings. I'm curious to see, they had at one point announced a potential revision to some USCIS forms to add social media identifiers to it. And so I'm curious to see if that will be implemented more broadly or how that will be played out at USCIS. And if that is the case, how does that impact processing times? Because I think at this day and age, a lot of people have many different forms of social media or social media that they forgot that they made in middle school. Like, how is USCIS really going to evaluate if someone has provided a clear and complete picture of their social media presence? I don't know. But I think that all of those are things that I'm kind of watching in the near term. And I think that also we have things like changes to the citizenship test and other things that are likely to come, but maybe with less importance to this your audience.
Celia, I think expanding upon what Cecilia just asked, I mean, I feel like you bring a unique perspective. 'Cause you're based in DC, so I'm sure you interact with a lot of interesting folks out there from various backgrounds. So just kind of hearing what you were maybe expecting to come down the pipeline, like how does the average human resources professional like navigate or just know how to go about, I mean, for them, their job is to, ensure that they're bringing in talent, but then you have all of these things popping up. How do they best navigate the legal immigration landscape?
It's tough. I do not envy them at all because they are obviously responsible for ensuring that they are able to hire and retain the best people available to their company. And that is, of course, going to be a challenge right now. And I think that they're also under a challenge because things keep changing. So they could spend a lot of time learning what the current status of things are, only for them to change overnight. And so I think that the best thing that I would say to someone, again, I don't envy their job, but I would say is to try to stay as informed as possible and watch the analysis that is coming out, because even if something seems very niche or small or unrelated to someone's particular immigration status or to the type of work that they or workers that they employ, I think that sometimes analysis can help to enlighten the ways or illuminate the ways that it actually is kind of detrimental or disruptive to processing of other visas and other statuses. And so I think that really just trying to stay abreast of everything that is happening is of course difficult. And so I understand that there are a lot of pressures on everyone's time, but especially for someone who is also responsible for ensuring that everyone is in valid status. And as we have statuses that are being revoked or changed or limited their ability to retain it for a long period of time, I think that it's not something that I envy, but it's something that's very important to continue to watch and focus on what is changing and what is being said about what is changing by people who are familiar with the issue area and are focused on it to some greater extent.
I feel like this kind of ties together in that early last year, so early 2024, you wrote a piece diving into the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. I want to say you were one of the only ones who actually dove into the immigration component of it. So looking at what you wrote to where we are now, how much of that has been implemented, and where do you think things go from there?
To say that a lot of what I wrote about has been implemented at least partially. And so I think that there has been an effort to focus on many of the things that I rose or I addressed in that piece and things that were proposed by Project 2025. And so I think that between that and the campaign rhetoric and things that were done during the first administration, I think that those three things in combination can really give us a good sense of what is still pending and what is still to come. If they did it during the first administration and they were successful, or they faced challenges, but maybe with slight revision, they could be successful. We saw that play out with the travel ban, for instance. And so we saw that kind of just a re-upping of previous term interests. And so we have the same thing with the Project 2025 priorities, that many of them have at least partially been implemented. And I think that we will continue to see more of them, or versions of them that function within this kind of legal environment that we're in right now. Some of them are no longer relevant quite as much. We had the Biden administration that eliminated the country eligibility list for the H-2s. And so now some of them are kind of no longer relevant. But I think that some of it is something that we're seeing, at least in part, being implemented on this scale. And part of theirs was mandating interviews for as many people as possible. And we've seen that both at USCIS and at state. And so we've seen small things like that that have actually played out in reality. And so I think that using that in combination with rhetoric that we've heard coming out of the White House and also with the first term priorities, I think we can kind of have a good sense of at least most of their priorities for the next few months or years.
Great. That was really helpful in kind of, taking a look at that comparison and what you maybe projected that would happen and seeing what's kind of at least partially come into play now that we're here in terms of, as we wrap things up today, would love to kind of see what kind of upcoming work or projects we can expect from you as we finish out the year. And I can't believe I'm saying it, but enter 2026.
Yeah. So I hope to continue to kind of focus on what is happening at USCIS. As I've said many times, I am still waiting on additional data. And so I hope that we will have that kind of clarity into an updated process to try to understand like how much of the slowdowns that we saw in those first few months was just a change of priorities that just meant that they needed to kind of reconfigure and readjust themselves to a different management system or a different kind of priority set, and how much of that is really going to be enduring issues that we see play out throughout the rest of the administration. And so I will be kind of watching that data, but I hope to also kind of focus on the future and what is going to be happening moving forward, and what are the changes that really would need to happen in order to meet the goals that they have. Many of their concerns around security or fraud, they have a genuine basis. It's not necessarily all cases, and that's how they've been applying those strategies. They have applied the same security risk to a 3-year-old as to an adult first-time applicant, which doesn't really make sense for interviewing and using government resources appropriately and efficiently. So I hope to kind of think through, okay, if they have genuine security concerns, is there a better way to address it that doesn't require using resources to interview children, and instead focus also on efficiency and something that is more sustainable, that helps us get to where we actually want to be, of economic strength and security, and kind of focusing on a futuristic or a near-term future plan that takes into account those concerns, but yet proposes other more sustainable ideas that also benefit the Americans and the businesses that rely on these systems to function in the first place.
I echo your sentiments, and I think we could all be in favor about more efficiency because more efficiency leads to fewer waste from the government. So we'll see what happens.
Yes, and a more tech-driven approach, like we talked about at the top of the episode too. So we'll all keep an eye out for that and for finally getting some of that data so you can come join us for the fourth time.
Yeah.
Of course, of course. You guys will be among the first to know.
Perfect. Love it. Well, Cecilia, we really appreciate you hopping on the show today. Always looking forward to your research and analysis. Thank you so much. And we'll be sure to link some of your recent pieces in our show notes so viewers and listeners can check those out. And yeah, thank you so much for hopping the show, and we'll see you around.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Cecilia.